There is an island in the Venice lagoon that the Italian government will not sell. Not because it is priceless, not because it is sacred, not because it holds the bones of a saint or the blueprints of an empire. They will not sell it because something happened there, something layered and compounding and terrible, and somewhere deep in the bureaucratic conscience of a nation that has seen everything, someone decided that Poveglia should simply be left alone. It sits there now, 14 acres of crumbling silence, less than a mile from the glittering canals of Venice, close enough that you can see the tourists on the water taxis, close enough that on a clear evening you can hear music drifting across from the restaurants along the Zattere, and yet no one goes. The boats reroute around it. The fishermen steer wide. Even the birds seem to land there with a kind of reluctance, as if they sense something the rest of us can only feel as a vague, wordless unease. This is not a ghost story, though it contains ghosts. This is a story about what happens when a place absorbs too much human suffering, too many chapters of desperation and isolation and death, until it becomes something else entirely. Not just a location on a map, but a kind of monument to every dark thing we have tried to hide by putting it somewhere out of sight. And it is a story about what that hiding reveals about the rest of us, about what it means to be a civilization that keeps building beautiful cities right next to the places where it quietly buries its worst moments. Poveglia is small enough to walk across in 15 minutes. It has no permanent residents, no shops, no roads, no electricity connected to the mainland grid. The buildings that still stand are in various states of elegant collapse, stone archways choked with vines, terracotta roof tiles scattered in the long grass like broken teeth, wooden doors swollen shut by decades of salt air and rain. The bell tower still rises above the tree line, though the bell was taken away long ago. Some say the tower still rings on certain nights. The fishermen who avoid the island say it is the wind. The fishermen say a lot of things to explain away what they do not want to explain. To understand Poveglia, you have to go back. Not just a generation or two, but all the way back to the beginning, to the moment when this small, flat piece of reclaimed land first entered the long and complicated story of human civilization on these waters. The lagoon itself is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in Europe. Long before Venice became Venice, before the palaces and the Doge and the trade routes that made this city the centre of the known world, people were living out here on the mudflats, finding ways to build permanence on impermanence, driving wooden pylons into the soft earth and constructing lives above the water. Poveglia was part of that original settlement. Records from the 5th century mention inhabitants on the island. Roman-era artifacts have been pulled from the soil. For a long stretch of early history, it was simply a place where people lived. Nothing more sinister than that, nothing more extraordinary. It had a small community, a church, the ordinary rhythms of lagoon life, fishing, trade, the slow passage of seasons measured by the tides. For roughly 600 years, Poveglia existed in the kind of unremarkable peace that most places exist in for most of history. It would have remained that way. There is no reason it could not have become simply another quiet settlement in the Venetian lagoon, neither famous nor infamous, its name forgotten outside local historical records. But then the ships came. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in Europe through the port of Venice. It came in the holds of trading ships from the Crimea, carried by fleas, by rats, by the invisible architecture of a catastrophe that no one yet had the language to describe. It spread through the city, with a speed that defied comprehension. Within months, Venice had lost a third of its population. Within years, Europe would lose perhaps half of all its people. The dying happened so fast, so absolutely, that the mechanisms of ordinary grief simply broke down. There was not enough time to mourn. There was barely enough time to move the bodies. And so Venice did what cities under siege have always done. It made decisions about space. It designated places outside the city where the sick could be taken, where the dead could be burned or buried, where the contagion could be contained, or at least where the city could maintain the psychological fiction of containment. Poveglia became one of those places. The sick were brought by boat and deposited on the island. Many of them were still alive. Many of them died alone in the dark, on that flat and featureless ground, with the lights of Venice visible in the distance. This is the moment everything changes for Poveglia. This is the moment the island stops being simply a place and starts being a purpose. The plague returned again and again over the following centuries. It came in 1576, killing Titian, the great painter, one of Venice's most celebrated sons. It came again in 1630, devastating a city that had barely recovered from the last wave. Each time, the calculus was the same: remove the sick, quarantine the dying, try to save the city. Each time, Poveglia received the human overflow of a civilization in panic. The island's soil absorbed it all: the ash of the cremated, the bones of the abandoned, the invisible residue of generations of suffering. Archaeologists who have worked on the island say that in some areas the ground is composed of up to 50% human remains. The earth itself, in the most literal possible sense, is made of the dead. By the 18th century, when the plague had finally loosened its grip on Europe, Poveglia had accumulated a weight of history that made it difficult to think of in ordinary terms. It had processed plague victims numbering in the thousands. Some estimates, though contested, range as high as 160,000 over the centuries. That number strains the imagination. 160,000 people brought to this 14-acre island, never to return to Venice or anywhere else. 160,000 endings, quiet and terrible, on this small piece of land surrounded by water. The island was used briefly for other purposes during the intervening years: a military checkpoint, a storage facility, a place of transit rather than destination. But its accumulated identity was already fixed. It had become the place where Venice sent its problems, and that identity, once established, proved almost impossible to shift. In 1922, the Italian government converted the island into a psychiatric hospital. When you first encounter this fact, it can seem almost too on the nose, too perfectly aligned with everything that came before it, as if history were editorializing. But the logic, at the time, was straightforward. The island was isolated, accessible only by boat, and already contained infrastructure from earlier incarnations, buildings, a bell tower, space. A psychiatric facility on an island made a certain administrative sense. Patients could not wander off. The institution could be self-contained. The water created a natural perimeter. What the administrators perhaps did not consider, or did not weight heavily enough, was what it would mean to send the mentally ill to a place already saturated with centuries of forced isolation. What it would mean to build a hospital on top of an ash field. What kind of institution grows in that kind of soil? The hospital opened, and for decades it functioned as a psychiatric institution functions, which is to say, It functioned according to the understanding of its era, and the understanding of that era was cruel in ways that were not always recognized as cruelty at the time. Patients were committed for reasons that ranged from genuine illness to social inconvenience. Women who were difficult, men who had broken down under the weight of poverty or war, children who were simply different in ways their families could not accommodate. They were brought across the water, and the water closed behind them, and they did not leave. The treatment methods of the early to mid-20th century in institutions like this one were often closer to punishment than medicine. Restraints, isolation rooms, procedures we would now categorize unambiguously as torture, electroconvulsive therapy administered without anesthesia, lobotomies performed casually, medications used as chemical restraints rather than therapeutic interventions. None of this was unique to Poveglia. These things happened in psychiatric institutions across Europe and America during this period, but at Poveglia they happened on top of everything else. They happened on top of the plague pits and the ash and the 6 centuries of accumulated suffering, and this, though it sounds mystical, though it resists rational framing, this seems to have mattered somehow to the people who lived and worked there. Stories began to accumulate. They always do in places like this. The stories follow a familiar grammar. A doctor who worked there in the mid-20th century, said to have tormented patients, said to have conducted experiments beyond the sanction of the institution, who eventually, depending on which version you hear, threw himself from the bell tower, or was thrown, or was somehow driven mad by the voices of the island's dead. The story is unverifiable. It may be entirely invented, but the fact that it exists, the fact that it was repeated and elaborated across generations of local knowledge, tells you something about how the people of the lagoon understood Poveglia. It tells you what the island had come to mean. The hospital closed in 1968, when the Italian government undertook a comprehensive reform of its mental health system. The Basaglia law, passed in 1978, would go on to close virtually all of Italy's psychiatric hospitals, replacing institutional confinement with community-based care. It was a genuine moment of moral progress, a society collectively deciding that the old model was broken, that warehousing the mentally ill in isolated institutions was not treatment, but abandonment, dressed up in clinical language. It was the right decision, but it meant that Poveglia, which had organized its entire existence around the function of isolation, suddenly had no function at all. The last patients were taken back across the water. The doctors and nurses and administrators packed what could be packed and left what could not. The buildings were sealed, after a fashion. The island was handed back to the silence, and there it has remained. The Italian government has owned it since the hospital closed. Over the decades, various proposals have emerged for what to do with it. A luxury hotel was suggested. The views across the lagoon toward Venice would be extraordinary, and the buildings, with sufficient investment, could be restored to something beautiful. A cultural centre was proposed, a museum, a park. Each time the proposals stalled and then died, and the island remained empty. When the government finally moved toward privatization in the early 2000s, offering a 99-year lease rather than an outright sale, it drew national attention and genuine controversy. An Italian man, Luigi Brugnaro, a businessman who would later become mayor of Venice, submitted a bid. A grassroots group of Venetians organized a campaign arguing that Poveglia should remain public, should remain outside the logic of profit and development. The lease was eventually awarded, briefly, and then cancelled, when the lessee failed to meet the investment commitments required by the terms. Poveglia reverted to the state. The Italian government, for reasons that are simultaneously bureaucratic and, depending on your disposition, something more, has never successfully transferred it. It simply sits there. You can take a private water taxi to the island, technically. There are tour operators in Venice who will bring you. The island is not legally off-limits to visitors in any absolute sense, though the crumbling structures are obviously dangerous, and the government does not maintain or encourage access. The tours that do run tend to market themselves with a vocabulary of thrill and transgression. They lean into the ghost story, the haunted asylum, the forbidden island. The sensationalism is understandable, commercially speaking, but it also does something unfortunate. It flattens the island, it turns centuries of genuine human tragedy into a backdrop for adrenaline, a spooky setting for photographs, something to be consumed and shared online and forgotten before the water taxi has completed its return journey. The people who know Poveglia best are not the tourists. They are the local fishermen, the ones who have worked these waters for generations, whose grandfathers fished around the island when the hospital was still operating, who grew up hearing the sounds that drifted across on still nights, cries and bells, and the industrial hum of an institution running its grim business across the water. These men, and they are mostly men, mostly older, mostly laconic, in the way of people whose lives are organized around physical reality and the unpredictability of the sea. These men do not talk about Poveglia in the language of ghost stories. They talk about it in the language of respect, or something that functions like respect, that looks from the outside like avoidance, but is actually something more considered. They do not fish in the waters directly adjacent to the island. They do not put their nets down in the shadow of those crumbling walls. Some will tell you, if you ask, that they have seen things. Others will tell you only that they see no reason to go there, that the fish are the same everywhere in the lagoon, that there are other places to be. What they are actually navigating, whether they would frame it in these terms or not, is the question of what we owe to the dead, specifically to the dead who did not die well, who died badly, alone in fear, in a place they were brought to rather than a place they chose. There is a moral weight to the accumulated suffering of Poveglia that is genuinely difficult to quantify, that does not fit neatly into the categories of historical fact or tourist attraction or real estate opportunity. The island carries something that the living keep bumping against and do not quite know what to do with. This is not unique to Poveglia, of course. The world is full of places like this, places where history's worst chapters left a physical residue that the present does not know how to process. Auschwitz, the killing fields of Cambodia, the slave dungeons on the coast of West Africa. These are the obvious examples, the ones that have been formally memorialized, that have been given a language of remembrance and institutional structures of preservation and education. But there are thousands of lesser-known places, hospitals, prisons, sites of massacre or forced displacement or epidemic that never received that formal attention, that exist in a liminal state between memory and forgetting, between the historical record and the silence that follows when no one is left who was there. Poveglia is one of those places. It sits in the middle distance between Venice's extraordinary beauty and the Adriatic's open water, and it accumulates everything that the city's official story does not have room for. Venice presents itself to the world as a city of art and architecture and romance, a city built on water, by an act of collective human will so audacious it still inspires awe 7 centuries later. And this is true. All of this is true. But Venice is also a city that for centuries managed its survival by being ruthless about what it sent away. It sent the sick to Poveglia. It sent the dying. It sent the troublesome and the inconvenient. It built its beauty partly by maintaining the discipline to move its ugliness offshore, out of sight, to that flat and unassuming island where the grass grows long and no one is watching. Every beautiful city has a Poveglia. Most of them are not literal islands in a lagoon. They are metaphorical islands. The neighborhoods that did not benefit from the prosperity, the communities that absorbed the industrial pollution, the populations that were moved to make way for the museums and the piazzas. The literal island is unusual only in its clarity, in the unambiguous physical fact of the water that separates it from everything else. But the mechanism is the same. The mechanism is always the same. You stand on the edge of Venice and you look across the water at Poveglia and you understand, in a way that is almost visceral, the architecture of a civilization's relationship with its own darkness. The city over there, shimmering and impossible and real. The island here, broken and silent and real. The water between them only 5 minutes by boat, an absolute boundary. There are people who have tried to change this, activists and historians and architects, who have argued that Poveglia deserves something better than permanent abandonment, that the ethical response to a place of such concentrated suffering is not to leave it to the vegetation, but to engage with it, to create a memorial space that does not sensationalize, but instead sits with the difficulty of what happened, that offers the dead something they did not receive in life. Acknowledgement, witness, the simple, radical act of being seen. These arguments are compelling. They are also, so far, arguments that have not succeeded. The Italian government has not memorialized Poveglia. It has not developed it. It has not opened it to the public in any structured way. It has done what governments often do with the most intractable problems. It has maintained the status quo. It has left the island alone and let the buildings continue their slow return to the earth, and the grass continue its growth, and the bell tower continue its silent vigil over the waters of the lagoon. And maybe, this is a harder thought to hold, but worth holding, maybe the abandonment is itself a kind of answer, an imperfect, unintentional, structurally inadequate answer, but an answer nonetheless. Maybe a place that absorbed so much forced containment, so many people who were brought there against their will and held there by the logic of walls and water, is being given something by being left unmanaged and undeveloped. Maybe the vines climbing the stone walls are not a failure of stewardship, but a kind of mercy. The slow dissolution of the apparatus of confinement, nature reclaiming the infrastructure of isolation, the island quietly becoming something it was never allowed to be when it was useful to civilization. This is perhaps too generous an interpretation. The abandonment was not a moral choice. It was a bureaucratic accident, a consequence of competing interests and failed negotiations, and the ordinary inertia of institutions. But places exceed the intentions of the people who manage them. They become what they become regardless of what the paperwork intended. And what Poveglia is becoming slowly, in the absence of human interference, is a kind of wilderness. Salt-tolerant shrubs and poplar trees, grass tall enough in some areas to disappear into, the buildings losing their angles as the stone settles and shifts. The island against all the uses that history assigned it, becoming a place where nothing is being done to anyone. At low tide, particularly in the early morning, when the lagoon is still and the light is that particular Venetian gold that painters have been trying to capture for 700 years, Poveglia looks almost peaceful. This is the word that occurs to you before you remember what you know about it, before the history reasserts itself and complicates the visual impression. In those few seconds before the knowledge catches up with the image, it looks like a place where someone once was happy. Maybe someone was. Probably someone was, somewhere in its long centuries. The plague workers must have had moments of ordinary humanness, a shared meal, a joke, a few minutes of rest in the evening sun. The hospital patients, in the gaps between their suffering, must have looked out at the lagoon and found some fragment of beauty in it. The administrators, the nurses, the maintenance workers who came every day and went home every evening, they had lives, complicated and irreducible, that existed alongside the institutional grimness. A place is never only one thing. It cannot be. It is always the simultaneous presence of all its moments, good and terrible and ordinary, stacked on top of each other, until the layers become too many to count. This is what Poveglia actually is, underneath the ghost stories and the bureaucratic stalemate and the atmospheric ruin photography that circulates on social media. It is an accumulation, a stratigraphic record of everything the lagoon civilization needed to put somewhere. The bones of plague, victims in the soil, the memories of patients in the walls, the aspirations of reformers who tried and failed to turn it into something better, the frustrated designs of developers who wanted to make it profitable, the nostalgia of fishermen who remember it differently. The confusion of a government that has never decided what it owes this place. All of this layered and compressed into 14 acres of Italian lagoon island. When you finally leave, whether you have been there in person or only in imagination, the image that stays with you is not the crumbling hospital or the overgrown pathways or the bell tower against the sky. It is the water. The strip of water between the island and Venice, crossed by water taxis and vaporetti that barely seem to register the island's existence, that navigate around it by habit and reroute without thinking. The water that was always in every chapter of Poveglia's history, the mechanism of separation, the medium through which the sick were delivered and the workers commuted, and the institution maintained its distance from the city that created it and depended on it and preferred, always, not to look directly at it. 5 minutes by boat, that is all it takes. 5 minutes of water and you are in a different world, the world of the Rialto and the Accademia and the Basilica di San Marco and the 10 million tourists a year and the impossible, improbable, magnificent fact of Venice. 5 minutes of water, and you are somewhere that most of those 10 million tourists will never go, will barely notice as they pass, will perhaps gesture toward from the boat and receive a brief, inadequate description. That island, you might be told, it's closed, it's abandoned, it has a complicated history. A complicated history, as if complexity were a reason to stop inquiring. As if the whole purpose of describing something as complicated were to give permission to move on without understanding it. Perhaps that is the thing that Poveglia refuses to allow in the end. It refuses to be summarized. It refuses the brisk efficiency of the guided tour, the tidy compression of the historical summary, the closure of a story that ends with a lesson cleanly learned. It sits there, in the middle of one of the most visited places in the world, and it insists on being looked at fully, which means being looked at as something that contains suffering that was not resolved, only moved, hidden, floated across 5 minutes of water and left on the other side. Every city has decisions it is not proud of. Every civilization contains the residue of its own expediencies. The difference with Poveglia is that you can see it from the window of a luxury hotel in Venice on a clear day. If you know where to look, you can see the tree line and the bell tower and the silhouette of buildings that are slowly coming undone. You can see it while you eat your breakfast and plan your itinerary and decide which museum to visit first. It is right there. It has always been right there. That proximity is the thing that does not let you go. That proximity is the thing that turns Poveglia from a dark curiosity into something closer to a question about distance and proximity, about how close we are willing to put the things we do not want to think about to the things we are proud of, about whether beauty and brutality can coexist across 5 minutes of water without one eventually asking something of the other. Italy has not answered that question, neither has Venice. Neither, really, has any civilization that has ever built something worth looking at. The island sits in the lagoon, patient and deteriorating, and waits. It has been waiting in one form or another for 700 years. It is very good at waiting. The bell tower rises above the trees, empty and still. The grass moves in the wind off the Adriatic. Somewhere underneath, in the dense and ancient soil, the remains of thousands of people who were brought to this island and never left are slowly, imperceptibly, returning to the earth that was always the only home they were given. The boats pass. The city shimmers on the water, impossibly beautiful, relentlessly present. And Poveglia says nothing. Because Poveglia has learned over 7 centuries of being the place where things are sent to be forgotten, that silence is not the absence of meaning, it is the deepest kind. And with that, our journey through this incredible place comes to an end. Every street, every view, every moment here has been a reminder of how beautiful and diverse our world truly is. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join us for more adventures from around the world. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.